I think it's all too easy when you get the information through for an audition and they're requesting a classical speech for you to absolutely panic. And to be honest, that is what I initially did when I got the information through for an audition that I did last week. But then when I started thinking about it a bit more, I thought I'm actually quite capable of doing a classical speech. And when I first started doing acting, I was doing more classical speeches in classical training than I was doing contemporary speeches. But when I went to the audition, what I noticed with other people as well is that when they talk about Shakespeare and classical texts, they say, all I've done is this and this and this. All I've done for Shakespeare is this. All I've done for classical texts is like this. And they're just belittling what they have done in a way that I feel like we don't do about modern texts or any kind of modern techniques. I think it's so easy to get in your head and think about all of these people who potentially have done so much more classical work than you. And I think because there's such a widespread perception that Shakespeare is really complicated and all of that, that people start to discount their ability. But I think even if you haven't done that much Shakespeare, there's still benefits within that, because you can approach it like any other text and just find the truth within it and be less caught up in all of these different ideas around what classical text should be and all of this different other stuff. So I think we're all very capable of doing Shakespeare, and I very much took out the idea of being scared of it, because I thought I can't go around thinking like that. I actually have done quite a lot of classical training, but I think taking my mind back and thinking about just how many different Shakespeare techniques and lessons I have learnt really reassured me and allowed me to enter the audition room so much more confidently. And I just never want to ever allow myself to spiral about my ability to do classical text, and I never want anyone to feel like that. So I thought I could compile loads of the different techniques that I found when I looked back and thought back about my various different approaches to Shakespeare, various different things that I've learned, just so we can feel inspired, I guess, about classical texts and think of it as a fun, creative thing to do and not be so intimidated by it. And I think maybe even if I ever feel uncertain for a second about Shakespeare again, I will be able to look back on this video and think there's so many different things that you can do with classical text, and there's so many different ways to go about preparing a classical speech for an audition. So in this section of the video, I want to talk about ways in which to get to grips with the context of your speech, because I think, to be honest, it can be quite intimidating knowing that there's a play that often will have 5 acts and will all be in language that was only really spoken hundreds of years ago. Like, I think that initially can be quite scary. So I thought I'd throw out loads of different ideas about ways that you can get to grips with that and feel more confident about that. And also things to keep in mind when picking your speech, because I think in the past I've done things and approached it in ways that I wouldn't now. Like, I think lots of people go to try and find the most obscure speech. They try to find a Shakespeare play that no one ever really does, or try to find someone else who was writing plays in the past who no one really performs that much, and find a speech that no one else will be doing. And that's what I tried to do, and that was my priority in order to show this panel, look at me, I'm engaged in classical text. You never really see this play in an audition room, do you? So therefore I'm really engaged in classical text, blah 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 blah. But I feel like now I approach it differently, because I feel like what often we can neglect is it a speech you're actually personally engaged with and you actually like? Because I feel like we prioritise so much looking to the panel like we're engaged by the name of the choice of the speech, but not by actually our own feelings about the speech, because you might have just picked a play that is really obscure and not actually be that engaged in classical text as a whole. But I think what shows more than anything that you're engaged is if it's an audition where they'll be speaking to you about the context and the play, is if you actually have a passion for the speech. And also don't pick anything that's way too old, because like if you're not 50 then it will be hard for you to portray a 50-year-old character realistically, because you don't have those 50 years of experience, and there will be things that you won't understand about the life experience of being 50 that will mean that it will be less believable. So just keeping that in mind and picking something that's within your casting type, and just pick a classical speech that you could realistically be cast as, over picking just something really obscure. Also, there are so many different options of ways that you can get to know the context of the speech, and one of them is reading the play, but some people personally choose not to do that if they feel like they could read summaries and then they can get to know it better, because sometimes the complex language can be confusing and can feel like they're not learning as much about the context of the play than if they read a summary. And also sometimes people are short on time, so they feel like they don't have time to read the play. So there's a few different ways you can approach reading the play. One of those is having an entire modern translation next to the play, which you can find lots of these different copies and translations next to the original play on various different websites online. And I also have a copy of this one, which can be useful if you want to write on it or if you want to reference back to it. What I personally like to do is sort of just take it easy, take it an act at a time and translate it. And then I also like to reference that and like interweave that with reading summaries of either scene by scene or read a summary of the act, just because I think sometimes you can get so immersed in the fine detail of the script that it can be harder to envision the story as a whole. So I think I see it's very common that people tend to feel bad about themselves if they don't understand straight away, and they put a lot of pressure on themselves to understand this Shakespearean language immediately, and they feel very bad about themselves if they don't. But I would just like to say, to counter that, like, we weren't around hundreds of years ago. How are you expecting yourself to understand it all straight away? Like, it's a journey to learn about this, and lots of people who are professional Shakespeare actors have to look up what things mean. Another way, I think, to bring Shakespeare to life a bit more is to put it in a modern context, and I think people sometimes do this, like I've done it before with the sonnets, because they are standalone text, and you could set that anywhere in a modern location, and you can set the context and the lead up to this character saying this speech in any kind of modern way, like put a modern story around it. So I think to feel more invested, sometimes it's nice to be able to watch the play, because then you sort of see it from an audience perspective. You can feel more invested in the story and engaged with the story, which can come across if you have to talk about the play in an audition, and it just makes, I think, me personally feel more engaged and ready to perform it if I feel like I really understand the story. I've seen different interpretations and adaptations, and some people might not want to do that because they might feel like their performance would then be influenced by that. But there are ways that you can watch the plays. You can look up, there's loads of different Shakespeares on iPlayer, there's different plays and the interpretations of it on YouTube, and also there's lots of different theatre streaming services. Like I used one, I don't really know much about it, but Marquee TV, I got a 7-day free trial, and through that I was able to watch the RSC version of All's Well That Ends Well. So that was a way that I was able to see that version of it, and then you can watch so many different classical plays on there, so it might be worth checking out various different theatre streaming services as well if you like. So the next aspect of performing classical text that I want to talk about is a massive topic, to be honest, but I thought I'd just share a few different thoughts on it, and that is the literary techniques that you can find in the speeches. Because I think what's so great about Shakespeare and all of these different classical writers that we still perform today is that they are still performed today for a reason. Like, they are such cleverly crafted, mostly in verse and poetry, pieces of script. There are lots of different speeches where there's like a certain vowel sound repeated, and having a really long vowel sound like an O sound or an A sound will give it an entirely different feeling. It might feel a bit more like lethargic, a bit more tired, a bit more like emotively expressive and devastated. But if you have like an I sound, that's a bit more of a shorter vowel sound, so it might be a bit more kind of snappy and to the point, and then that will affect potentially how you might want to go around making the most of the literary offers, I guess, that the text provides you. And the same with consonants as well. And you can look at the kind of vocabulary, I guess, of your character as well, and like what words are they saying most often. Like some of them who are really obsessed with someone else will be like you, or like naming another name of another character a lot. So that can be good to keep in mind, to just think what is on this character's mind. Also, what I find really interesting to use personally is to understand the typical rhythm of blank verse, which is what the majority of classical text in Shakespeare is written in. And then once you understand the pattern, then you can also notice ways where like it doesn't always line up. And so Shakespearean classical text is usually written in iambic pentameter, and I don't know why I'm finding it very difficult to explain, but basically it means that each line has 10 syllables and every other syllable is emphasized. Try and give you an example, really exaggerating the emphasis so you understand the kind of rhythm that the text is usually written in. But for example, Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing says, "What fire is in mine ears, can this be true?" And I think that's really interesting because, for example, the literary features that you could use from that is that every single word there is one syllable. So how would that change it? Like if she was speaking in multiple syllable words, that would sound a bit more like maybe her head's more like together and she's less shocked. But the fact that it's so staccato in rhythm, because every word's only one syllable, means that she's sort of more in shock and she's more trying to process everything. And also it's interesting how the emphasis often tends to fall on really important words in a phrase, like can this be true? And once you start using that, you'll realize that not everything actually fits the rhythm, and sometimes the really important words are not on stressed syllables, and that seems like the character might be a bit more all over the place, so you can use that. Or some of these lines will have more than 10 syllables, they might have 11 syllables, because a line that I've looked up and found that doesn't quite fit the 10 syllables thing is a line from Hamlet where he says to be or not to be, that is the question. That has 11 syllables, so then you can think about how that will influence the performance and what that really means. So that's why I think it's really useful to know about, because whether or not the audience are consciously thinking about these features are audibly part of the speech, and they will be subconsciously noticeable that that sort of doesn't fit with the usual flow, and that there are certain sounds in the words and everything structured in a certain way. Because the way that the speech and the literary features are structured is reflective of the inner thought process and structuring of that thought process of the character. And really thinking about the speech in that kind of way is really useful, because when I learned about classical text, I realised there's so much intricate detail to it, and there's so many different techniques being used that once you're aware of them, you can really use them as a performer. So the next step I want to talk about is finding ways to really awaken the text, bring the text to life, and make it just feel really grounded in truth and natural in your own voice, because I think all too often it can sound really floaty and poetic when people do it, and it doesn't feel like genuine, real conversation and real people speaking their true emotions. But I just thought I'd basically throw loads of techniques at you that I've used to bring classical text specifically to life. The first thing I think it's really important to do is to just get the whole speech and the text feeling really familiar to you, so that it doesn't feel so alien and unnatural when you're speaking it. So you feel like you're really free to just connect with it, play with it, not just get stuck in a specific way of doing it. So one of the things that lots of people do in classical speeches is sort of physicalizing and applying movement to the punctuation. I feel like it's a bit difficult to explain, so I thought I'd demonstrate it. So like every time there's a comma and you're saying the speech, you change direction, and then every time there's a full stop, you stop, and just applying some kind of physical indication of each type of punctuation just, I think, really allows you to physically get to know the text a lot more. And there are loads of different techniques that you can do when walking around the room with a speech and saying the speech over and over again that can get you really used to it. And I would recommend you to do these and just really commit to them, because I feel like sometimes you can feel a bit silly doing certain acting exercises, but just really trust the process and really go for it. So you can do the speech with your tongue sticking out, you can apply a little tune to the speech, you can go around and mime and physicalize each verb so you really understand and think about what kind of verbs are in my speech. And you can go around saying just the first word of each line and then just the last word of each line, and I think that allows you to get to know patterns in the way that the speech is written in a way that you might not have otherwise noticed is there, so then you're aware of the speech as a whole. And also, I think my favourite exercise probably within this is assigning each noun, as you say it, to a different object in the room, so then you're just aware of like how many times each noun is mentioned, and it just feels a lot more grounded when you're actually able to direct a noun towards an object, because I think otherwise it's all a bit up in the air. So really grounding it allows you to then express the emotions and direct it somewhere, which I feel like allows it to be firstly a lot more clear to the audience, and also it allows you to just really commit and go for it, whereas otherwise it can be a bit more ambiguous, unclear, confusing. You can just try to keep it alive and different in many different ways, like maybe try it with a completely different circumstance, like try it like you're held against gunpoint and you're saying this speech, just so the stakes can be high and you can try it, and maybe you'll find something new within applying it to a different circumstance and you won't get stuck in a certain rhythm. And just remember, like any speech, it's just someone talking at the end of the day. So when I have the opportunity to have someone else stand in as the other character in an audition, I find that really useful to just look into their eyes and speak the truth and feel their reaction and feel the pressure of having to say these words in that moment and what I could lose or gain by saying these things, and just really trying to get my point across just really allows me to forget everything else, because I think thinking too much about the literary techniques or any of the background work that you've done in the moment is going to take you out of it. So just trust that everything you've done leading up to that is there, and then just connect with it and just speak the truth of the text. So to conclude, I guess, firstly, I think sometimes you can get too set on a speech, but if you feel like you're not liking it so much anymore, or you're feeling disconnected from it, or you feel like you've overworked it and you prefer to just start fresh and apply the things that you've learned from working on that speech to a new speech that you might feel more connected to and just like more, then I would maybe recommend you doing that. But also, I think, to be fair, if you found this video, you will know, but there are so many different Shakespeare resources, so many different books, online content, like there's so many different websites talking about the different plays and translating the plays and explaining different opinions on the plays. And also there are videos that talk through summaries of the plays, they talk you through performing some of the different main speeches. So I've looked through that because I think it's interesting to hear other people's perspectives on specific speeches. And also, if you're looking to learn a bit more about performing Shakespeare, there's the Playing Shakespeare series, which I think you can find on YouTube, and it's kind of old, I think, now, but it's got so many really big actors in it. Like, I think Judi Dench is in it, and all these big Shakespearean actors are talking about and explaining various different techniques and thoughts about performing Shakespeare, so I found that really interesting to watch. And also Tom Hiddleston, he talks a lot about Shakespeare as well, so I did spend a lot of time, and I have done, like, researching Shakespeare performance and classical performance and listening to different podcasts from actors who perform Shakespeare. So I think there are so many different resources out there. So if you're feeling a bit lost or you want to learn a bit more and feel like you've become a bit more educated on Shakespeare, there are so many different free ways to do that. Those are a few of my different Shakespeare recommendations. If you have any tips or thoughts yourself or any questions, then please do leave them in the comments for me. And if you're preparing to do any classical speeches in audition soon, then good luck. I wish you all the best, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!